Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on the fourth day of Tata Literature Live 2020, the 11th annual Mumbai International Literature Festival and the first one to be completely digital. Our thanks to our title sponsor Tata and our co-sponsors Tata Steel and Tata Projects. This session is presented by Godrej and it's supported by the British Council. I hope you're looking forward to this amazing performance as much as I am. After all, wasn't it P.G. Wodehouse himself who said that everything in life that's any fun, as somebody wisely observed, is either immoral, illegal, or fattening? Sir P.G. Wodehouse is widely regarded as the greatest humorist writer in the English language. Over a career that spanned no less than 73 years, he wrote more than 70 novels, 300 short stories, 20 plays, poetry, and lyrics for more than 300 songs. In addition to his busy career as a novelist, it is incredible to think he was at the forefront of the invention of the Broadway musical and was writing film scripts for MGM in Hollywood at the time of the birth of the talking pictures. His much-loved characters, Jeeves and Bertie, and so many more, have kept generations in splits over the years. And this evening, we're delighted to have James Naughtie, Sindhu V, Hal Cazalet, and Robert Goodale to give us an insight into the wonderful world of Wodehouse and his creations. Wodehouse received many awards during his lifetime, but the one he was most proud of was the Mark Twain Medal in 1936 for having made an outstanding and lasting contribution to the happiness of the world. Well, surely that says it all. So, please sit back and let Jeeves pour you a Plum and Tonic, the Wodehouse remedy.
Little dog, and everything the girls said when. For them was the days when a lady was a lady and a gent was a perfect gent. For them was the days when a lady was a lady and a gent was a perfect gent.
Hello and welcome to A Plum and Tonic, the Wodehouse remedy. As we've heard, we invite you really to cast reality aside as gently as you can. Shelve all the cares of the world as we take you on an escape to the sunlit haven of that great writer, P.G. Wodehouse, whom we've heard is one of the great comic geniuses of the last century, known affectionately by those who knew him by his nickname, Plum. And we're going to focus on some of his most loved and inimitable characters, immortalized in Bertie Wooster, for example, the idle rich English gentleman, his ingenious butler, valet really, strictly speaking, Jeeves, who had the solution to every dilemma, the soupy and sentimental Madeline Bassett, Florence Cray, the woman that God forgot, the eccentric peer, Lord Emsworth of Blandings Castle, and of course his prize pig, his pride and joy, Empress of Blandings, and the multitude of those commanding aunts who sometimes, as Wodehouse said, surged like a distant sea. Smith with a P, Uncle Fred, so many others. Many of you will know them all. We'll explore perhaps how they came to be, certainly what made them tick. Now, to kick off proceedings there, we heard an excerpt of the song Sir Galahad. It was performed by Sylvia McNair, Hal Cazalet, with Stephen Blyer on piano and Mark Stewart on banjo, of course, a favourite Wodehouse prop, as it were, in some of the stories. That was the hit song from the 1917 musical Leave It to Jane, for which Plum wrote the lyrics. As we've heard, he was a prolific master of the Broadway musical. And the record year that he had saw 5 musicals running simultaneously on Broadway. We'll hear more of that later. He was, as we know, a wordsmith who could somehow conjure up in a word or a phrase that was diamond sharp something original. Everything seemed always to fit perfectly. The rhythm of the prose, that wonderful moment in which he ended a description. And as we'll hear, it was that skill, which of course made him rich and successful, that led directly to the novels and stories that attracted readers in magazines and then in published volumes, which of course found him an endless source of fun and uplift to so many around the world. Now, we're very lucky to be joining you here in Mumbai and elsewhere with a happy hour of memories of this great writer. We'll hear extracts and character and some of his own reflections on his craft and his songs. So it's a pleasure for all of us to be with you. Wodehouse is certainly a tonic. I can't count the number of times when in a dark moment or two I've picked up a book like The Code of the Woosters and found myself falling about in laughter, even if, as a Scotsman, I have to bear the brunt of people who remind me frequently of the immortal line directed at Angus MacAllister, Lord Emsworth's grumpy Scots gardener, that it is never difficult to tell the difference between a Scotsman bearing a grievance and a ray of sunshine. It will not be like that today. There's not much sunshine here around in the UK, but we're hoping that this short series of readings and songs will bring you some brightness at a time which we know is so difficult for so many people around the world. So let me introduce my colleagues today, a wonderful crew. Sindhu V, an award-winning comedian, writer and actor. And Sindhu, I want to ask you, first of all, how it was that you discovered this writer and what he meant to you down the years.
Well, I discovered, first of all, hello everybody, everywhere, and also in Mumbai. A special hello to you. I'm a Delhi girl, but when I sit in the UK, I'm happy with all of India. So hello, Mumbai. And then for those of you in Delhi, please kiss some monument on my behalf. Or maybe not kiss, it's COVID, just flying kiss. Anyway, I was introduced to P.G. Wodehouse by my father when I was very young. And it was because he had friends who would come over and they would speak all through dinner only in P.G. Wodehouse. And for anyone who doesn't understand this, you haven't read enough P.G. Wodehouse. They would have entire conversations. And I think that was fascinating to me from a young age. And then I started reading the books. I was raised at a time when there wasn't that much television. There was no internet. So what did you do? You read. And my father had all of the books. And that's how I was first introduced to it. I was very young. I must have been 10 or 11.
And you still find it a solace, Sindhu?
Oh, well, more than a solace. I think as a comedian, I have a lot more respect for P.G. Wodehouse than I did just as a reader, because the comedic structure of his sentences is so tight. You couldn't slip a piece of paper. There's not one extra word, and that's beautiful.
No one could deliver a punchline quite like him.
No, and such a tight punchline, The big thing when you're writing stand-up is you try and use the least words for the maximum impact, and he was absolutely a master at that. I also think that it's a wonderful way to learn how to observe characters. And so I've encouraged my children to read P.G. Wodehouse because just from an English comprehension point of view, it's amazing. So, and I have all the P.G. Wodehouses, and I go back to them. I'll just read a few chapters, and I find it not just funny, but it's kind of juice for my brain. So I'm a huge, it's juice for my brain, for my writing brain.
That's a great phrase, juice for your brain. Sindhu, thank you very much. We'll hear from you soon. Hal Cazalet joins us too, singer, composer, and rather wonderfully, step-great-grandson of P.G. Wodehouse. So, Hal, you've kind of inherited something of the mantle and some of the glory, I suppose.
Well, certainly I've enjoyed his whole world. It's like a ray of sunshine. And I was introduced to his work at a very, very early age. But I come with a big step. I'm a step great-grandson, although I enjoy musical theatre and writing for musical theatre. But it's just always been a great tonic for me, turning back to Plum's books. I got into his writing through his lyrics, amazingly. As a child, I slept right beneath the P.G. Wodehouse archive. It's quite a weight of history to have above you. And I got into his writing through his lyrics. I went and unturned a box one day of songs, of manuscripts. And all the music was by the Gershwin brothers, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, Ivan Novello, and the list was endless. And I thought there
Great
must be
figures.
something. This is rather amazing.
Amazing.
And it's wonderful, as we had at the beginning with Sir Galahad there and Mayher's lovely introduction, that for many people who perhaps pick up a novel and fall in love with Jeeves and Wooster or whatever the reaction they have to it, they don't realise this extraordinary background on Broadway, where he was, you know, the star of stars. I mean, he could write lyrics for any of those great tunesmiths that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, he was very inspired by W.S. Gilbert, but the difference was that Plum set the lyric to Kern's music, so he had the emotion of the music first, and that was quite a different dynamic. And I'm a firm believer, and when I got into reading his novels, and I mean, he's still the writer the only writer I laugh out loud at. That you could see that all those characters came from the stage shows. They walked from the stage onto those pages, and they were actors and scenes and very, very well crafted, but it came from his career, his first career, his other career as a lyricist on Broadway.
Well, thanks very much, Hal, and we're going to hear from some of those characters in a moment in the person of Robert Goodale, who joins us now, Olivier award-winning writer and actor, and somebody who loves the work. And Bobby, I must say to you that what both Sindhu and Hal have alluded to, and which you as an actor of great distinction must feel the whole time, is that these phrases and sentences are written for the voice, aren't they?
Oh, they're completely written for the voice. And, well, yes, when I first discovered Wodehouse, I read the beginning of Right Ho Jeeves, which I'm going to do a little bit of an extract from, in which he talks to an audience, basically. And that's what turned me on to him, actually. Or that wasn't originally what turned me on to him. What originally turned me on to him was I came to him much later in life than Hal and Sindhu. I came to him at about the age of 20, I think. I was sharing a house with my twin brother, and he was a complete Wodehouse nut. And he used to read every so often, you know, he'd just walk into the sitting room and read a little extract from it. And I thought it was brilliant. And it was usually when I was pissed, actually. So I thought, oh, well, maybe this is just, you know, me being, you know, in another state of mind. So I never knew whether it was genuinely funny in the cold light of day. And then I suddenly had this idea of doing a one-man show, and I didn't know what to do. I'd just been up to my cousin's wedding in Edinburgh, and I thought I must go to the Edinburgh Festival, I must do a one-man show, and I thought, well, maybe this Wodehouse chap is quite good after all. I better have a look at it, and I did, and I realised, for the reason I've just said, when I read the beginning of Right Ho Jeeves, I realised here is a person who is on stage talking to an audience. So,
it's lovely, Bobby. Thank you. And you prepare yourself, because we're going to hear an extract in a moment. And I think the points you made about the readability of Wodehouse, the way that the language flows, what it does and how it lifts your spirits is really the key. And it explains why people fall in love with this writer. We're going to crack straight into a Wodehouse story, which is brought to life here by Robert Goodale, who we've just been talking to, who's going to perform an extract from that one-man show, Right Ho Jeeves, of course, the name of one of the books in which these characters have their being and rise to the heights, and which were part of his show at Edinburgh, which he's described. I would introduce, in one fell swoop, really, to two of his most curious and really fascinating characters in different ways, Madeline Bassett and Gussie Fink-Nottle. Bassett is a pretty drippy girl who thinks the stars are God's fairy chain, daisy chain, and Gussie Fink-Nottle is obsessed with the newts that he finds in ponds all over the English countryside. Now, the duo, of course, continue to feature in many books, not surprising because they're wonderful. And the will they, won't they kind of element to their relationship is very pertinent to Bertie Wooster, for reasons that we will now hear.
Jeeves, may I speak frankly? Certainly, what I have to say may wound you. Not at all, sir. Well, oh, no, wait. Hold the line a minute. I've gone off the rails. I don't know if you've had the same experience, but the snag I always have when I'm telling a story is this dash difficult problem of where to begin it. I mean, if you fool around too long at the beginning, you know, trying to establish atmosphere and all that sort of rot, you fail to grip and your customers just walk out on you. Get off the mark, on the other hand, like a scalded cat, and your public is at a loss. It simply raises its eyebrows and can't make out what you're talking about. And I see that I've made the second of these two floaters. I shall have to hark back a bit to the day on which I returned from my holiday in Cannes. Well, Jeeves, what news on the old Rialto? Anybody been phoning or calling during my absence? Yes, sir, Mr. Finknottle has been a frequent caller. Are you sure? Yes, sir. Oh, well, I'm blowed. And I'll tell you why I was blowed. This Finknottle was one of those freaks that you meet from time to time in life's journey who can't stand London. Upon arriving at man's estate, he went down to live in a village in Lincolnshire, where from which he never stirred, and devoted his entire life to the study of newts. Are you sure you've got the name correctly, Finknottle? Yes, well, it must be Gussie then, I suppose, but what on earth can have brought him to London? I am in a position to explain that Mr. Finknottle confided to me his motive in coming to the metropolis. He became because a young lady is here, and an acquaintance of his had recommended that he place his affairs in my hands. And what is Gussie's problem? Well, sir, each time he tries to put together a proposal of marriage, his courage fails him. Oh, I see, and yet if he wants this female to be his wife, he's got to say so. What? I mean, you know, only civil to mention it. Yes, did he mention her name by any chance? And perhaps I might know her. Yes, she is Miss Bassett, Miss Madeline Bassett. Madeline Bassett. This Bassett, I must explain, had been a fellow visitor of ours at Cannes. I'd seen quite a bit of her, and what made it all so painful and awkward was that the more I saw of her, the less did I seem to be able to find to say to her. It was not her beauty, Mark, that thus numbed me. No, she was a pretty enough girl in a droopy, soupy, sauce-wide sort of way. No, what caused this disintegration was her whole mental attitude. Now, I don't want to wrong anybody, so I'm not going as far as to say that she actually wrote poetry, but her conversation was of a nature calculated to excite the liveliest of suspicions. As regards the fusing of her soul and mine, therefore, there was nothing doing. But in Gussie's case, the position was entirely different. Oh, yes, he's just the type for her, and she's just the type for him. In fine, a good thing, and one to be pushed along with the utmost nerve, Jeeves. Strain every nerve, Jeeves. Very good. I then went off to the drones, where I bumped into Pongo Twistleton and spent a restful afternoon throwing cards into a top hat. Returning in the evening hush, I'd scarcely opened the front door when I heard voices, and on entering the sitting room I discovered that these proceeded from Jeeves, and what at first sight appeared to be the devil. A closer inspection informed me that this was Gussie Finknottle dressed as Mephistopheles. Oh, what ho, Gussie, long time since I've seen you. Have a spot. Oh no, I just came round to ask Jeeves how he thought I looked. How do you think I looked about it? Well, the answer to that, of course, was perfectly foul, but we Worcesters are men of tact. I evaded the question. Well, Gussie, I've been hearing all about you and Madeline. Jeeves has told me everything. Oh, do you know her? Yes, certainly I know her. What beats me is how you ever got in touch. Where did you meet?
Oh, well, she was staying with a friend of mine in Lincolnshire, near mine, and she was out for a walk with her dog, and the dog got a thorn in its foot, and when she tried to take it out, it snapped at her. So, of course, I had to rally around.
And fell in love at first sight?
Yes, and in fact, it was she who was just giving me the ticket of invitation to this party, and Jeeves particularly wanted me to go as Mephistopheles because he thought I might be emboldened in a striking costume like this. And you can't get away from the fact that Jeeves' idea is pretty sound. I mean, in a colourful costume like this, I might pull off something pretty impressive. I mean, look at newt. During the breeding season, the male newt becomes brightly coloured.
But you're not a male newt.
No, but I wish I was.
Yes, but if you were, Madeline Bassett wouldn't look at you. Well, not with the eye of love, anyway.
Yes, she would, if she was a female newt.
But she isn't a female newt.
No, but supposing she were.
Well, if she was, you wouldn't be in love with her.
Yes, I would, if I was a male newt.
A slight throbbing about the temples told me that this conversation had reached saturation point.
Well, due to a set of unfortunate circumstances of the usual kind, Gussie doesn't make it to the party, and he's forced to spend most of the evening wandering around the metropolis in scarlet tights, still dressed as Mephistopheles. He is, however, presented with another chance to make his move towards Madeline when they both end up staying by the kind of chance in which Wodehouse specialises in the same country house in Worcestershire. Despite the rather romantic soundings of Brinkley Court, home of one of Bertie's many aunts, Gussie remains unsuccessful. So Bertie decides himself to take Madeline for an evening stroll around the capacious grounds to sweeten her up and to prepare the way for his hapless friend.
Oh, look. Look at that little star up there. I wonder if it feels lonely. I don't think so. A fairy must have been crying. Eh? Well, don't you remember? Every time a fairy sheds a tear, a wee star is born in the Milky Way. Have you ever thought that, Mr. Worcester? I hadn't, no. Most improbable. Oh, talking of shedding tears. Oh, look. Look at the little bunnies. Don't you love this time of year? Don't you love this time of day, Mr. Worcester, when the sun has gone to bed and all the bunnies come out and have their little suppers? You know, when I was a child, I used to think that rabbits were gnomes and that if I held my breath and stood quite still, I should see the fairy queen. Yes, talking of shedding tears, it may interest you to know that there's an aching heart here at Brinkley Court. It's having the dickens of a time. It can't eat, can't sleep, all for the love of you. Oh, please don't say any more, Mr. Worcester. I understand. No, I won't be so silly as to pretend not to know what you mean. I suspected this of your can when you used to stand and stare at me, not saying anything, but with that dumb, yearning look in your eyes. And then you followed me down here this evening with that same dumb, volume-full thing of eye in your eyes this evening. And now you halter out those stammering words. No, this does not come as a surprise to me. But I'm sorry. I'm afraid it's impossible. There's somebody else. Not that he's said anything to me. it's a silly little story. And I was out for a walk with my dog, and the poor wee mite got a thorn in its foot, and I didn't know what to do. And then this man came along. I realised, listening to her words, she must be talking about Gussie. I mean to say, there can't have been a whole platoon of young men taking thorns out of her dog that day. Oh, yes, I've just remembered something. I must go into the house and write a letter. If you don't mind, I'll be going in now. Oh, look, here comes Gussie Finknottle. He'll look after you. And as I spoke, Gussie sidled out from behind a tree, and I passed away and left them to it. Already I felt, as I legged it back to the house, a happy end must have begun to function.
Well, unsurprisingly, things do not go according to plan, although, as Jeeves explains later, when Bertie asks him what could possibly have gone wrong.
Mr. Finknottle was the victim of a sudden unfortunate spasm of nervousness. Upon meeting with the young lady, he admits to having lost his morale. In such circumstances, gentlemen frequently talk at random, saying the first thing which happens to enter their heads. In Mr. Finknottle's case, this would seem to have been the newt. He supplied Miss Bassett with very full and complete information, not only with regard to the common newt, but also to the crested and palmated varieties. And he was going on to explain that after the breeding season, the male newt returns to the land and lives off slugs and worms, when the young lady rose and said that she thought she ought to be returning to the house. And then she went, sir.
Yes, she went, as she often did, the beginning of many encounters involving Gussie and Bertie. Bobby, thank you so very much for taking us into the world of Bertie and Jeeves, and Gussie Finknottle dressed awfully as king as ever about newts. We've got a flavour there of Wodehouse at his best, and of course that is why he's widely regarded as a very English writer. But of course his novels are now translated into 30 languages, and many more to come, and there are Wodehouse societies thriving all around the world. Those characters, the stories, the humour, endure today as they always have. And I want to bring Sindhu V back in here. Sindhu, you were saying something interesting about your own background in India and the way that you were introduced to the books early, and the way that that language, the storytelling that Bobby's just illustrated to us, that idea of just telling something which is perfectly structured and which seems to move from paragraph to paragraph with inexorable ease, is such a joy for anyone who wants to get to grips with, you know, how to write and speak English.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't put it better than you just did there, Jim. That's a great sentence, by the way, that you just produced just like that.
I couldn't do it again. I think it came out anyway.
No, thank God it's recorded. For the purposes of this panel today, I spoke with my father on FaceTime. My father is 87 now and in good health, and he's in India. And I asked him, I started speaking to him about P.G. Wodehouse and said, you know, when you were in your 20s, what was it that was so attractive? And the first thing he said is, well, he's very funny. I'm like, okay, can we get a little deeper than that, Dad? Because my father grew up in South India. He didn't go to a big, you know, English-speaking university. So I said to him, where did this start? And what he said to me was very interesting. He said that when he moved to university, of course, everything was in English, even though it was a smaller engineering college in South India. But in order to, you know, in their spare time, such as it was, they read, and he had a friend who had access to P.G. Wodehouse books. And from the moment my father and this friend met and started speaking, these books became a huge common pastime. And what was interesting to me was he said that it wasn't just the English, which of course is beautiful, but my father was raised speaking quite formal English, you know, at that time in India. But also he said that it was a really good way for them to poke fun at the British. Because obviously my father was
Yeah.
born in 1933, and there was a huge swell of opposition to the, to the British government. However, through P.G. Wodehouse, especially through Bertie and the aunts and the chef who was, always in a bad mood, and the uncles and the people who were buffoons, it was a way to think about England that was free of any political friction. And it was a great relief, because for my father and his friends to be able to talk about Britain and poke some fun, but it was someone British who was doing it, was a wonderful way to really digest a lot of what was going on in their own lives growing up.
Well, it's a fascinating insight, because on the one hand, he was a lovely, beautifully tapered sword to kind of stick in the British establishment in the Raj days, but at the same time, it was gloriously structured and inspiring in its own right.
Absolutely, and it had nothing. And the other thing my father said was there was nothing in those books and those words that made us feel that we had to be culturally more liberal than perhaps we were as Indians. Or there was, I remember when I was growing up, there was a show on Indian TV, and it was Benny Hill. Now, my mother disapproved. Oh, you mustn't watch that. It's very bad stuff. Because culturally, that was way too much for her. But P.G. Wodehouse didn't have that problem. It was about family, and it was about young men pursuing young women, but in this kind of Gussie Fink Nottle kind of way. It was all very above reproach in any cultural sense. And it was, as my father said, it was pure, unadulterated joy of the language on the page.
I think one of the interesting things I want to raise with you before we move on is the question of the portrayal of women. And of course, on Broadway, he knew a lot of actresses. He understood, actually, the personalities of people who were very big people, and probably some of them intolerable people on stage. And he then came to try to represent women of a certain kind in the Jeeves of Worcester stories, for example. How do you look on him as somebody who could catch something of the feminine?
Well, given that we don't have 6 days for this conversation, I'll try and keep it short, because these days, the feminine and feminist and so on. As a comedy writer who's got a script of her own that I've been working on, and that that is in the works, I think P.G. Wodehouse was astounding for his time in his ability to make unlikable women riveting through humor.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a character after my own heart, an unlikable woman who you can't but love because of the humor that she brings. He did that so perfectly. And he was able to poke fun at so many things about these women, whether they were being too feminine, or whether they had a lot of guile, or whether they were just ditzes like Madeline.
Yes.
He was able to do that, but he was able to also show the position of the matriarch, all his aunts. And I think that is enduring, whether it's in Indian humor, whether it's in Italian humor. You have the matriarch. And he did this quite unusual thing where, these days you read all the time, oh, men are funnier than women. And I think Parkey said it recently and everyone went crazy. Oh, men are funnier than women. And Hitchens had said it. The fact is that P.G. Wodehouse made women much funnier than he did any of the men. Bertie was funny. Jeeves was funny.
Yeah.
But the uncles were all buffoons. You were laughing at them, not with them. Whereas the female characters, you laughed with them, because the way that, one of the... I know that Aunt Dahlia is the nicer aunt, but say Aunt Agatha, she completely ripped into Bertie, and we laughed with her because she knew he was a layabout, a layabout,
and she was the one who ate rats with her teeth,
yes,
whereas
and
Dahlia
was
much more.
was nice. But I think for P.G. Wodehouse to have done that at the time when we weren't analyzing fiction in terms of gender, perhaps we didn't notice. But today, when it's such a contested issue, you look at P.G. Wodehouse and you say, he made women funny, and that was a very special thing that he did. Of course, you can always find fault with lots of things, but I think
Of
he
course.
does do that well.
I think you've brought us back to the theme of subtlety, and we've talked a little so far about his profession as a lyricist on Broadway and in Hollywood, and we're going to hear read for us by Sindhu and by Hal the lyrics for the song "If I Ever Lost You." Now, it was heard in the 1921 musical The Golden Moth. And it demonstrates, really, picking up the points you've just been making, Sindhu, how differently the two sexes tend to express feelings of love. And it's rendered with that diamond-sharp language in which Wodehouse was the master. Sindhu and Hal.
I have not known you long, and yet it's plain that this was meant to be. For something told me when we met that you were my affinity. I cannot tell you all you mean to me. Think how sad the flowers would be if sunshine went away. Think how sad the bees would feel without a summer day. Think how a couple of lovers would swoon if they walked out one night and found no moon. Then you'll understand, and I know that you do, how I'd feel if I ever lost you.
You have inflicted on my heart a wound that time can never heal. You woke in me right from the start, emotions I cannot conceal. Just let me sketch for you the way I feel. Think how sad a carrot would be if no boiled beef was near. Think how sad an egg would feel if ham should disappear. Think how a sausage's hopes would be dashed if one day it awoke and missed its mashed. And what grief a steak would feel if it found that there wasn't an onion around.
Hal, talking to you about this, he can't write a verse without making you laugh and without fitting every word perfectly. You mentioned earlier Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, the Gershwin brothers, who were the masters of Broadway. And to be able to produce lyrics of that kind, to sing with the music, as it were, was something that very few people had. A lot of people thought they had it, but didn't. And he did. Did it just come naturally?
I think it did, and I think a lot of people say that Plum wasn't musical. I don't believe that for an instant. I think he had the most incredible natural instinct. Jerome Kern used to ring him up at 3 in the morning and put the receiver down on the piano and play him a melody. And Plum, who was half asleep, used to take down what they called a dummy. So he used to write it down on a piece of paper, la-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-dum. And then he'd totter off back to bed. Well, Jerry Kern probably worked on the second act trio. But something happened in that sleeping process, because when he woke up the next day, the lyric was perfectly defined and written by about 11 o'clock the next morning. And he just sent it off to Kern or speak the lyric over the phone. So he had this natural ability, and that was the advantage I alluded to at the beginning with writing lyrics to a tune. He could see where the high spots were with the melody. And he also had this extraordinary knack that we've all touched on, in that he said something in a very plain and common speech-like way that just sang beautifully. And therefore, as we're talking about characters, I really believe that the characters came from those Broadway shows because the characters were made to live and breathe, and the audience felt all their feelings because Plum was forced.
It's interesting. I mean, you mentioned how he could write down a kind of version of what he heard from Jerome Kern on the phone, which means he must have been musical. He obviously had a feeling for it. But there was something else going on Broadway, which was a kind of revolutionary development of character, not stiff, rather like what happened to opera in Europe in the 17th century, where stiff kind of classical cut-out characters became real people. And that was happening on Broadway, and that just played right to Wodehouse strengths, didn't it?
Completely. And it was then going to play onto his strengths as a novelist. Because as I say, those perfectly formed characters became the characters in his books. And you can almost see in the short stories the chapters, the scenes. The scene changes. The the immaculate connection, the fluidity of the musical theatre without the music, musical comedy without music, he called it, that became his prose writing. But it was effortless to him, and it became, as I say, this sort of natural thing, because the tunes that he worked with the great writers. So and for example, the rehearsal pianist on the show Miss 1917, when he had these big 5 musicals running on Broadway, was a chap who put out his hand, and Plum said, "Hello, I'm Plum Wodehouse. We haven't met. What's your name?" He went, "Oh, George Gershwin." This is this rehearsal pianist, and
it's absolutely fantastic. And of course, that that legacy in Broadway is still there now. Some people listening to us may not have, as it were, plumbed the depths, no pun intended, of that kind of that repertoire. But we're going to hear you, Hal, yourself, not live, but singing "My Castle in the Air" with Stephen Blyer on the piano. Now, this was from Miss Springtime, which is a 1916 musical. Just think of that, 1916. It was the first musical put on, I think, by Wodehouse, Jerome Kern and Guy Bolton, the first time they'd worked together. And it would launch their careers. Just say something about it. I mean, this was a landmark moment for him, wasn't it?
It was a big moment. It was the era of the great entrepreneurs and the producers, Flo Ziegfeld and Abraham Lincoln Erlanger, who was about 5'6" and had a Napoleon complex. Anyway, he was the czar of Broadway, and he commissioned a show for the New Amsterdam Theatre, which was a vast, great barn on Broadway. It still stands today. And so this was Plum's big break as a lyricist in his own right, working alongside Guy Bolton and the great Jerome Kern. Englishman, Anglo-American, and American. And this was American music, and this was American musical theatre. And it began like this.
That I've never lived in yet, built so many years ago in days that I forget. It has no stone battlements and great big wooden beams. Its walls and its bars are the dust of the stars, and its gate the gate of dreams. Come out there for a visit, I've lots of room for friends. And if you ask where is it, it's where the rainbow ends. It's somewhere there in fairyland, where there's never cloud or care. We'll have joy and laughter, mirth and song, and we'll all be happy as the day is long. In the shelter of my castle in the air. Everything is perfect that you'll find there when you go, just beyond the Milky Way and where the moonbeams grow. No one ever worries there, for everything goes right. The sky's always blue and no lovers untrue, and your life's one long delight. Come out there for a visit, I've lots of room for friends. And if you ask where is it, it's where the rainbow ends. It's somewhere there in fairyland, where there's never cloud or care. We'll have joy and laughter, mirth and song, and we'll all be
Jim, I think you're on now.
Wonderful music from Jerome Kern and reflective lyrics really from Wodehouse. So to understand comedy without the music, let's hear some of his own words on that subject, musing on how the novelistic creations, wonderful as they were, came from that background. Here is Hal Cazalet to read it.
In the matter of plots, I find that I use for short stories a method exactly opposite to the one which gets me my best results in case of novels, if in these earnest days I can apply such a dignified name to my longer yarns. When I want to write a short story, I sit down on one chair, place the feet comfortably on another, put notebook, pencil, matches, pipe and tobacco handily on my lap, select a character, and then keep on sitting till I've discovered what happened to him the time he forgot his wife's birthday, or on the afternoon when he went to the test match at Lord's. In other words, the story grows out of the character. It may turn into an entirely different story halfway through, but the character remains the same. A novel is another matter altogether, far less simple. And it is to the strain of getting plots for novels that I attribute the hideous lined face and bald head which I have today. A good novel ought to have a theme, so I start by trying to think of one. Failing in this, I dig up a scene, any scene, so long as it seems to have possibilities. I then take the actors into the scene and try to learn more about them. Then I think of other scenes, bung them down on a bit of paper, and pin this bit of paper to the first bit of paper. Well, this goes on for about a week, by which time my drawer contains perhaps 10 bits of paper, carefully pinned together and scrawled over with the sort of thing the fever patient mains in his sleep. Then, just as I'm beginning to feel that nothing will emerge from this chaos, scene number 15 suddenly clicks with scene number 8. I join them and write them down on another bit of paper. And then, when I'm shaving or in my bath, it occurs to me that by turning the blackmailer into a dog fancier and giving the girl an aunt who keeps rabbits and eliminating the curate in favour of a pickle manufacturer from Milwaukee, I have got a faint, shadowy suggestion of a plot. At this point, I really get going. I stand no nonsense from my characters. The pickle manufacturer has become a dowager duchess, and like it, in order to fit the scene where the dog fancier, now a blackmailer once more, goes to the hunt ball so as to keep in with the girl's aunt, whose rabbits have been taken away from her and replaced by a racing stable. The final stage begins when one or two characters who can't be altered creep into the story. Then I know where I am. As regards characters, some of those which have appeared in my stories have come from chance remarks from friends about men they've known. Years ago, a cousin of mine told me that he was at Winchester School with a long, thin, solemn, immaculately dressed boy who used to wear an eyeglass and talk kindly but not patronizingly to the headmaster. The character Smith was based on that youth, who changed his name from plain Smith with an S by preceding it with a silent P, as he thought that would make the name more distinguished.
A very tall, very thin, very solemn young man, gleaming in a speckless top hat and a morning coat of irreproachable fit, mounted the steps and rang the front doorbell. A small maid answered and stood transfixed as the visitor, producing a monocle, placed it in his right eye and inspected her through it. "A warm afternoon," he said cordially. "Yes, sir." "But pleasant," urged the young man. "Tell me, is Mrs. Jackson at home?" "No, sir." The young man sighed. "Ah, well," he said, "we must always remember that these disappointments are sent for some good purpose. No doubt they make us more spiritual. Will you inform her that I called? The name is Smith, P-S-M-I-T-H. P. Smith, sir? No, no, Smith. The P, I should add for your guidance, is silent, as in psychiatrist or psychic.
The character of that lovable rogue Eucridge was a friend of my pal W. Townend, the writer of sea stories, who told me about him.
Gentlemen, said Eucridge, it would seem that the company requires more capital. I can raise 10 bob. What? How? I'll pawn a banjo. But you haven't got a banjo. No, but George Tupper has, and I know where he keeps it.
Jeeves was an invention of my own. I was in the middle of a short story when it suddenly struck me that a young man of my hero's mental caliber could not possibly have thought out the solution of a problem in which a friend of his was involved. And it seemed to me that a super intelligent valet or butler would just meet the case.
But where did this particular world, from which these glorious characters sprang, find its way into his mind in the first place? Sindhu.
Well, so first of all, P.G. Wodehouse is Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, which you probably knew. And I didn't, but now I do. So he started his working life as a journalist for a London evening newspaper called The Globe. And during one of his holidays, he sailed across the Atlantic to New York. And there he met an agent who gave him a check for $500 at that time for 2 short stories. I mean, as legend has it, or as the story goes, within moments of getting this check, P.G. Wodehouse resigned from the Globe. He just thought, well, forget this, $500, and he took a room at a hotel that was inhabited by a group of young writers, and there he sat and wondered, what is he going to write? Because I don't think he'd really ever thought of this beforehand. And then one day, while he was drinking a milkshake at a drugstore, I mean, just that language shows you what time it was. He suddenly had an idea, and he thought that rather than have nothing to write about, what he could do was read about, the curious breed of earls and dukes who reside in the English countryside and whose butlers know more about everything and anything than them. And that whole breed, that whole world, he thought, let's describe that. And, he thought up a story and he called it Something New. And it involved an earl who liked to dine alone in his bedroom slippers in the library of his large country estate, and a man who was also compelled by circumstances to make the occasional trip to London. That was it. I mean, that is where it came from. And I mean, if you imagine how much fodder he had, I mean, you did have an Earl of Sandwich. That's just facts. And so he sort of went into that world and took off from there.
Don't often see your lordship in the club.
Lord Emsworth, having examined the bill of fare with mild curiosity, laid it down and became conversational.
Oh, no, Adams, I seldom visit London nowadays. London does not attract me. The country, the fields, the woods, the birds.
Something across the room seemed to attract his attention, and his voice trailed off. He inspected this for some time with bland interest, then turned to Adams once more.
What was I saying, Adams?
The birds, your lordship.
Birds? What birds? What about birds?
You were speaking of the attractions of life in the country, your lordship. You included the birds in your remarks.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. To be sure. Yeah, do you ever go to the country, Adams?
Generally to the seashore, your lordship, when I take my annual vacation.
Whatever was the attraction across the room once more exercised its spell. His lordship concentrated himself on it to the exclusion of all other mundane matters. Presently, he came out of his trance again.
What were you saying, Adams?
I said that I generally went to the seashore, your lordship.
Eh? When?
For my annual vacation, your lordship.
Your annual vacation? What about your annual vacation?
My annual vacation, your lordship.
Oh, your annual vacation? What about your annual vacation?
So with PG Wodehouse, once, shortly what came of this was Jeeves and Bertie Wooster, which is all very well and good, except for the fact that once these characters had been created, they're like a cast of actors. They sit and they wait for more and more material to be written for them, and they won't go away until it's written.
Indeed, and we all want more. Now, we've heard a little bit about how those characters, some of them, evolved, but Hal, you tell us about the Wodehouse character itself, because you visited his Ethel, your great-grandmother, out in Long Island in New York in the early 80s. That was rather soon after Wodehouse had died. Your father, of course, knew him well. What did you make of the ménage?
Well, I was very young at the time, and I was very glad to have met my great-grandmother. I went out with my sister Lara, my brother David, my parents. It was a true love story. It was a long marriage, and Ethel was very frail when I met her, but she was a gregarious character. She didn't so much as come into a room, but she made an entrance. And they were very, very fond of each other. She was fiercely protective of him as well. As we all know, the great enemy of creativity is interruption, and she made sure that he was never interrupted. He had his day where he'd get up and work in the morning. They'd meet for their martini, a very strong martini, which she would always finish the end of, and Plum used to call it, that was his dividend. And then he went for a walk in the afternoon with the dogs. He'd probably write another 3 or 4 hours, and then sit and watch his favorite television program and generally read. Incidentally, he read a lot because he read the complete works of Shakespeare every 4 years. Think how helpless I felt when I first heard that. But she was wonderful. My father went out there and spent many summer holidays, and Plum was the most adorable character. Not funny to converse with, but terribly sweet, terribly kind, and terribly generous. And those were the stories that were passed down. And
what were the memories, particular memories, that your father passed on to you of, of visiting this, extraordinary household?
Well, there was always the martini, the religious drink. Plum used to sit and do he used to sit in a chair with a piece of paper, and he'd talk to my father because he was always interested in getting news from back home. Who won the test match, the rules of one-day cricket, etc., etc. And I know India is a country mad about the cricket too. So he missed his cricket. So, but as he was speaking to my father, he'd be filling in a piece of paper, and my father thought he was sort of writing the shopping list for the next day. But it was actually the Times crossword that he used to do at breakneck speed. He used to just fill it out and put it down, and then carry on talking about something else. And the memory of all the animals, the dogs, and to a certain extent, their home became a rescue centre for stray pets.
And they had an extraordinarily close relationship, didn't they?
Ethel obviously completely understood Plum and his world and the quiet genius that he was. And so the few people that could come and distract him, the better. And he really lived and breathed in that world that did come from Broadway. And I say he did live in this other world. It was sort of the Garden of Eden, where all these wonderful characters lived and breathed. And if he was sitting down in a chair, this is another thing. that he would simply always be working. So he'd always be working out a plot or something that had bugged him in the morning. I remember Ethel saying that. But she was a glamorous lady, and my last images of her is coming down the stairs, literally in sequence, like one of Ziegfeld's Follies, coming down the stairs, making an entrance, pouring the drinks, which incidentally the ice cubes were covered in perfume. So we, as a child, I used to drink water with sort of Chanel perfume, which was, interesting. But they were a lovely couple.
And it was a sort of devoted household in many ways, wasn't it? I mean, there was a kind of extraordinary, an emotional atmosphere.
There was. The great gap, of course, in both Plum and Ethel's life was the death of Leonora, his beloved daughter, adopted daughter. He did a stepdaughter adoption in 1914, and she became his own. And that was a wonderful relationship. And she was very protective of Plummy, as she called him. Well, Snorkels was the name they used for each other. And when she died in 1944, he simply looked up and said, "I thought she was immortal." And he also crowned her queen of her species, which I thought was rather wonderful. So it was loving household.
What about the notes that Ethel used to leave for him? I mean, it's an extraordinary story. Take us into it.
Well, to take this love story one step further, Plum used to go to bed early, and Ethel used to go to bed very late, sort of cleaning out the icebox or whatever. And she always, every night, left Plum a note on his placemat for breakfast, because she'd be up late. And my father, who was staying, went into the kitchen one morning and to pour himself an early cup of tea. And she saw a note from Plum, typically left on Plum's placemat. And it simply read, "I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love. I'm in love with a wonderful guy."
That's a rather nice way to wake up. And another very happy thought about that household was that it was dog mad.
Dog mad. And as I said, they used to adopt pets. And the reason why they had so many pets is because the affluent New Yorkers used to come to Long Island for their holidays. And they simply left their dogs at the end of the summer as sort of strays. And Plum knew all the dogs in the area. He used to go to talk to Guy Bolton on his walk about plots and things like that for musicals and novels. And he used to name all the dogs in the area, and invariably the dogs and the cats found their way into their house. So it was really wonderful, and also found their way into his stories, none less than the fearsome dog Macintosh, and the Mixer, and the cat Webster. And I just want to go on to a very quick unpublished piece of Wodehouse's, commenting on the personalities of his two dogs, Wonder, a Pekingese, and Loppy, a boxer. When confronted by a stranger, he was outside a car in which the Wodehouses were stopped, but had reason to open one of the rear doors. And it goes something like this. The first thing that met the eye, Wonder, being asleep under a pile of vegetables, was Loppy, who rose courteously to greet him, slowly uncurling what must have looked to the eye of a stranger like yards and yards of beige-coloured dog. A boxer, I should mention for the benefit of those unfamiliar with the breed, is the sweetest natured dog on earth, but is handicapped by a face that seems to hint at the vilest of passions. His mouth is large, his eyes are bright and penetrating. He wears a perpetual stern frown, and at the corner of his mouth there is always a visible long white bared tooth. And when confronted with a new acquaintance, he makes a low rumbling sound. It's really a sort of purr, but it closely resembles a growl. I was not surprised, accordingly, that the visitor should have taken it big. Overbalancing in his emotion, he brought his hand down on the vegetables, giving Wonder a sharp jab in the stomach. Well, you can't do that sort of thing to a female Pekingese with impunity. Indeed, there is practically nothing you can do to a female Peke with impunity. There was once an officer attached to the staff of a Maharaja in India who owned a female Pekingese puppy. And one day, probably because it was his birthday, or perhaps just from some idle whim, the Maharaja decided at that moment to hold a parade of 1,100 elephants in the palace grounds. So he had the 1,100 elephants assembled, and they were standing to attention in serried ranks when the Pekingese came sauntering out of the front door, and seeing them, instantly assumed that this was a plot against her well-being. With a shrill bark, she charged, and the 1,100 elephants broke as one elephant and stampeded back into the jungle. It was, I believe, months before the last was recaptured and returned to store.
Thank you very much, Hal, for that canine interlude. I want to turn to you, Bobby Goodale, now. We heard you giving us some flavour from the Jeeves and Wooster stories earlier, and a little bit of Smith. You know, you talked to us about discovering Wodehouse, age 20, and then your blinding flash that it might be quite fun to do a one-man show. These characters, indeed, animal and human, simply come tumbling out, don't they?
They do indeed, yes, yes. So to start with, well, let's just start with the dog. Yes, yes, Bartholomew in Code of the Woosters was, what I should say is, because I've talked about the one-man show, but I haven't talked about the fact that 20 or so years after doing the one-man show, I was approached by the producer who produced it up in Edinburgh and asked to do it as a much bigger show, and with the blessing of the Wodehouse estate, Hal included, was allowed to do a much bigger version of Code of the Woosters, which my brother and I wrote, or adapted from the book, and called Perfect Nonsense. And Perfect Nonsense was in the West End for a year, and then it went on tour around the country, and then it did a world tour, and it visited India twice, once to Mumbai and once to Chennai, and I can never get the name right, what used to be Bangalore, but Bengaluru, is that correct, Sindhu? Bengaluru? Perfect.
I often think, Bobby, that Code of the Woosters, if you were to recommend a starting point for anyone delving into Wodehouse, perhaps nervous, wondering, yes, what's this stuff going to be like, can I get it? As a piece of comic storytelling, it's almost unparalleled, isn't it? I mean, the sheer plotting, the wonderful thing, the little, brown leather-covered notebook, the dog, everything, the way it fits together, Watkins, yes, Bassett, all the rest of them.
No, it is unparalleled. I mean, the only problem is that it's better if you've read Right Ho Jeeves first, because Right Ho Jeeves is the precursor to it, and it sets up the story. But Bertie does, Bertie fills you in beautifully at the beginning of Code of the Woosters, so it's okay. But yes, it is. I mean, it is a farce. It is the greatest farce ever written in my book, greater than anything that was ever written for the stage.
One of the great challenges, I think, to anybody who says they love P.G. Wodehouse, you say, right, okay, tell me the plot of the Code of the Woosters. It's a bit like saying to an opera fan, please tell me in detail the plot of The Marriage of Figaro, and nobody, yes, can actually do it because they always forget the little twist and the turn that he's put in perfectly,
which is essential. And yeah, they happen at the beginning of every chapter or at the end of every chapter. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And we, in Perfect Nonsense, just to make things even worse, we added another level to that book, but in the fact that Perfect Nonsense had the conceit that it was Bertie Wooster who had hired a West End theatre, thought that he could tell a story all on his own, then discovered within 20 seconds that it was all going to pot. And
he needed Jeeves.
Who should be that? Jeeves. And what should Jeeves have done? Yes, of course, he's produced a set for Bertie, and he's also ready to play all the other characters along with...
Well, for those of us who've seen the performance, I mean, it's a wonderful conceit. The other thing, just as an actor, as a man who's used to walking onto a stage and trying to create a character who springs out for the audience. The wonderful thing about Wodehouse, of course, is that he can pin a character to the wall in the first instant with a phrase, and you never forget them.
You never forget them. Roderick Spoke with an eye that can open an oyster at 60 paces. Madeline Bassey, the droopy, soupy, sentimental exhibit. The Duke of Dunstable has a moustache which rises and falls like seaweed on an ebb tide. No, they're marvellous, and they are such keys. So when I did the one-man show, I didn't have to think about any of the characters. They just happened. You know, I just went, oh, Gussie. Oh, yes, he's got the voice that has something distinctive and individual about it, reminding the hero partly of an escape of gas from a gas pipe and partly of a sheep calling to its young in lambing season. And it just says, and there you are, you know, it says everything. Yeah.
Well, and you know where you are at every point. And of course, the wonderful thing is with Bertie as a sort of narrator, taking the reader into his confidence and saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, I've lost my... I mean, you give it again. Give us a little bit that you started
yes.
with the opening of your opening piece.
Righto, Jeeves, which is, yes, may I speak frankly, Jeeves, certainly so. What I have to say may wound you, not at all so well then. No, wait, hold the line a minute, I've gone off the rails. I don't know if you've had the same experience, but the snag I always come up against when I'm telling a story is this terrible problem of where to begin it. I mean,
but then he does, of course, and he leads us by the hand. And yes. So we always know where we are, and none of us need to worry about remembering the plot of The Code of the Woosters, because he'll take us through every step. Bobby, for the moment, thanks so much. Now, it's maybe significant thinking about the character of Wodehouse, that in his childhood he only saw his parents 4 times between the age of 3 and 15. This was a different age. They were stationed in Hong Kong, and like Kipling, he was known by some people as an empire orphan. And as a consequence, he was brought up in England by no fewer than 20 aunts. Well, we can see what they produced. All pretty formidable characters in their own way, and many of whom would morph into Agatha Odelia and others. For the mere mention of an aunt, most had nephews, you know, climbing trees and pulling them up after. Now, the most imposing of that particular posse were the Threepwood sisters, all 10 of them.
If I can just give you an example of one of the aunt's readings before we cut to the end and give you some wonderful quotations from the Wodehouse canon. This is Bertie with an exchange to Jeeves. No character was more in the clutches of his formidable aunts than Bertie. If I had my life to live again, Jeeves, I would start it as an orphan without any aunts. Don't they put aunts in Turkey in sacks and drop them in the Bosphorus?
Odalisks, sir, I understand, not aunts.
Well, as we leave Bertie in the clutches of his good and deserving aunts, Madeline and Gussie contemplating newts, and Blanding's castle bathed in perpetual sunshine, let us send you away with some glorious quotations from the Wodehouse canon. Lord Hoddesdon felt like a tiger who has hoped for a cut off the joint and has been handed a cheese straw.
She had a soft, dreamy voice, like clotted cream made audible.
I am Lord Tilbury, said his lordship, as though he was a man unveiling a statue of himself.
Into the face of the young man who sat on the terrace of the Hôtel Magnifique at Cannes, there had crept a look of furtive shame, the shifty hangdog look, which announces that an Englishman is about to speak French.
As he kissed his mother, Ronnie Fish was aware of something of the feeling which he had had in his boxing days when shaking hands with an unpleasant-looking opponent.
The couple were so closely entwined that it seemed only powerful machinery could separate them.
As for Gussie, many an experienced undertaker would have been deceived by his appearance and started embalming him on sight.
Aunt Agatha's demeanour was now rather like that of one who, picking daisies on the railway, has just caught the Rajdhani Express in the small of the back. Well, we hope that our foray into Woodhouse's world for all of you has provided something of a soothing tonic for everyone who's been kind enough to tune in with us this evening, thanks to the Mumbai Literature Festival. And there's an obvious way to end, which is to quote the immortal words of another great comic novelist of a different kind, Evelyn Waugh, who summed up the credo of P.G. Wodehouse as an admirer with great affection and hitting the spot. Mr. Wodehouse's world, he said, can never stale. He will continue to release future generations from captivity that may be more irksome than our own. He has made a world for us to live in and delight in. And so say all of us. My thanks to my colleagues, Sindhu, Hal and Bobby, and our collective thanks to all of you. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you so much.
That was superb. So good, in fact, that your MC Meher ran off to buy herself some Woodhouse right now. Thank you, everyone. Panelists.
Great, thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
Big thanks to Godrej presenting this session, which was supported by British Council. See you tomorrow at 9 a.m. for Art, Politics and Society, Deconstructing Classical Music by T.M. Krishna. And I'd like to end from a line from Plum itself. As we grow older and realize more clearly the limitations of human happiness, we come to see that the only real and abiding pleasure in life is to give pleasure to other people. I'm not Meher, I'm Ratnabali, signing off. See you in the next session.